This isn't a dungeon.
It sees us as livestock.
By the time they figure out what I'm building, it'll already be too late.
The first thing I want to say is that I did not expect to die on a Tuesday. Actually, I am not certain it was Tuesday. I had lost track of days somewhere around the 6th week, when you spend 3 months flat on your back in a hospital bed with tubes in your arm and nothing to look at but a ceiling tile and the occasional nurse who avoided eye contact. Time stops being a sequence and becomes more of a general condition. I was sick. I had been sick for a while. I was going to stay sick until I was not. That is the whole story of my first life, more or less. What kept me sane, and I mean this genuinely, were the dungeons. Not real ones, imaginary ones. The kind you build in management games. The kind where you have to balance resource loops and visitor incentive structures and floor progression curves. I had nothing else to do. The hospital had bad Wi-Fi. My phone was dying. So I lay there and I designed, in obsessive detail, the most perfectly engineered dungeon I could imagine. Floor by floor, traffic flow, visitor psychology, retention mechanics. I designed it for 3 months, right up until the moment the heart monitor did something complicated and the light in the ceiling stopped being interesting. Then a voice said, "Would you like to try again?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. She was standing in the dark, or what felt like the dark, a small figure with pale eyes and wavy hair that reached past her shoulders. She looked young, but the way she held herself said she was not. Formal posture, serious expression, the face of someone who had been doing a difficult job alone for a very long time. "You were reincarnated as my dungeon master," she said. "Your mission is to lure adventurers with greed. Create a dungeon that takes their blood, their magic, and their lives." She said it the way you might explain a health insurance policy. Patient, precise, thoroughly convinced this was normal information. "I see," I said. "I actually remember your voice. You were there the whole time, weren't you? In the hospital. That sound I thought I was imagining." Something shifted in her expression, barely visible, but there. She did not confirm it. She asked if I understood my mission. I said I had a proposal instead. Her name, I decided, was PETA. She objected to this on the grounds that she already had a designator and did not require one from me. I explained that PETA was a unit of measurement. A PETA is 1024 to the 5th power, which makes it extremely large, and that the name was therefore technically a compliment. She stared at me with those pale eyes for a long moment. Then she handed me the dungeon points and said, in the tone of someone who has accepted a situation they cannot fully explain, "Decide how to expand, summon monsters, produce your hot spring." She said, "Hot spring," the way you might say hot spring if you had never been warm in your life. The dungeon had been hers alone for 100 years, growing to 8 floors before stagnating for 40. She had saved every spare point she had for decades to summon a human master, because that is what a core does when it has run out of ideas. What she got was me, a dead man with a management game obsession and a very specific theory about visitor retention. I said, "Status open," and a window appeared in front of me. It looked like a smartphone game. PETA made a sound that I can only describe as incredulous despair. She explained very precisely that dungeon masters are supposed to manifest scrolls, books, physical interfaces, the kind you spend weeks conjuring and months deciphering. "This is easier," I said. "That's not how it works," she said. I had 5,405 dungeon points and a floor design menu that was cleaner than most city building apps I had used when I was alive. I spent about 20 minutes reading the parameters. Water temperature, maximum 50 degrees Celsius. Volume cost, 1 point per 300 liters. Miasma saturation controls. Beauty effect sliders that corresponded, roughly, to how aggressively the mineral content would attack dead skin cells, clogged pores, and inflammation. PETA watched me work. I think this was the first time she felt genuinely obsolete. I set the water to 42 degrees. She suggested 50. I told her I would explain why she was wrong after the dungeon opened. The construction timer read 22 hours and 32 minutes. 1 floor, PETA said. Normally takes me months. "I know," I said. She grumbled something I did not catch. I let her. The plan was simple in the way that actually working plans usually are simple. Give people something they cannot get anywhere else. Make the benefit immediate and visible, and design the floor so that the first floor gives just enough to make them want the second. Dungeon masters were supposed to kill adventurers. I understood the logic. A dungeon generates points from what visitors do inside it, but dead visitors do not come back, and word of mouth does not work when everyone who entered is gone. A hot spring with measurable beauty effects on the first visit. That was the lure. Not gold, not magic artifacts, skin. Because I had spent enough time in a world with beauty products to understand that there is almost no upper limit on what a person will pay or risk to feel beautiful. Peta thought this was absurd. She was a dungeon core. She had spent 100 years trying to understand why humans wanted gold and gems. She understood they wanted them, the same way you understand that cats want to knock things off shelves without grasping the underlying cause. I told her to trust the plan and go to sleep. The dungeon finished building while I waited. Then the earthquakes started. Small ones, barely tremors, the kind a new dungeon throws off when it solidifies. Someone posted a notice at the inn in town. 2 veteran adventurers came to investigate that same afternoon and reported nothing unusual. A hot spring at the back of a shallow cave, no monsters of note, water tested non-toxic. They did not get in. They were professionals. Professionals do not bathe in unknown dungeon water. I was disappointed, but this was also fine. The next investigators would not be professionals. 2 days later, 2 female knights arrived. They were assigned a reinvestigation, the official kind, thorough, documented. They came through the entrance with the words Hot Spring Dungeon carved above it, cleared the first floor of bats and rats and things that barely qualified as monsters, and spent 3 hours confirming there was nothing in the dungeon except a warm pool of water at the bottom. Then they got in. I watched from the master room, which I had furnished, mentally, with the energy of a man who had been dreaming of a monitoring system for 3 months. The water started working within the first few minutes. The senior knight's hands, calloused from years of armor and training, cracked at the knuckles in ways that no ordinary moisturizer would touch, began to soften. The junior's skin cleared. A heat rash that had been spreading under the senior's armor disappeared. They were soaking in exactly 42 degrees of precisely calibrated mineral water, and they were not going to be able to pretend this was normal. They stayed too long, both of them. They got dizzy from the heat and collapsed on the cave floor, which was a problem I had not fully designed around, and which I noted for future adjustment. Then they went back to the palace. Told you, I said. Peta was asleep. I said it anyway. The next morning, the 2 knights returned to the palace late at night and reported to their superior. Their superior was furious until she looked at them. The junior had come in that morning with the kind of face that could only be described as unfair. The senior's hands, which the superior had seen destroy doors in training exercises, looked like she had spent a month in the finest bathhouse in the capital. The superior's fury lasted approximately as long as it took her to finish looking. Word spread before sunrise. By the next morning, 250 female knights were standing at the entrance to my dungeon. I had planned for enthusiasm. I had not planned for this. They killed the first floor monsters with professional efficiency and swarmed the bath without ceremony. There was nothing graceful about it. There was nothing the least bit peaceful about 250 people fighting over access to a pool of water. Peta woke up, took one look at the chaos, and began cheering for the fights on the grounds that conflict generated more points. I told her that was not the correct attitude. She pointed out that it was working anyway. She was right. The first day of the frenzy generated over 3,600 dungeon points. The bath was not large enough for 250 people, so I used those points immediately. I doubled its size overnight. That generated more conflict. The next day, the fighting was worse, and by the time the dust settled, I had cleared 20,000 points, enough for a second floor, in a time that apparently shattered every record that had ever existed for dungeon expansion. The previous fastest had taken over 80 days. Mine took 5. I started construction on the second floor the same night. 2 months later, I had 8 floors. The first floor held 5,000 people, not 500, 5,000. A bath the size of a small lake, fed by precisely calibrated mineral water that cleared skin on the first visit and improved measurably with repeated use. Noble ladies were arriving with armed escorts. Escort contracts had become a minor industry. The queen herself had visited under hundreds of knights, a procession so large that the surrounding road had to be reinforced. Floor 2 gave hair its gloss back. Floor 3 removed spots. Floor 4, which I was quietly proud of, reversed 3 years of aging in a single visit, a one-time effect, which I had designed deliberately, because an effect that wears off gives people a reason to return to the floor that refreshed it. Floor 6 moisturized in a way that no surface cream could replicate. Floor 7 removed wrinkles. Floor 8 removed scars, old scars, the kind that take years to form and do not soften on their own. When Floor 8 appeared, the noble ladies who had given up on their faces came back. The design was doing exactly what I had built it to do. Each floor gave more than the last, and each one created a desire that only the next floor could satisfy. A noblewoman who had only reached Floor 2 knew, from looking at a woman who had reached Floor 6, exactly what she was missing. The dungeon did not need to advertise. The visitors advertised for it every time one of them walked into a room. "You're manipulating all of them," PETA said once, during a quiet moment when the bath count was high and the points were accumulating without any effort on my part. I thought about it. "I prefer the term designing incentive structures," I said. She stared at me with those pale eyes. "It is the same thing," she said. "Yes," I said, "but one of those sounds better." I watched the queue from the master room. The plan I had built in my head over 3 months in a hospital bed, floor by floor, mechanic by mechanic, was running, not as a fantasy, not as a management game I would close when visiting hours ended, as a real thing, in a real dungeon, with real visitors getting real results. The dungeon was supposed to drain adventurers of blood and magic and life. I had not done that once. I was, technically, failing at my job from the first day. I could not bring myself to care. The dungeon was doing what it was supposed to do, and I was doing something I would prefer not to discuss. PETA had gone to sleep in a huff. 1 full week of silence. Her consciousness switched off like a lamp. The master room was quiet. The monitors showed the usual traffic. Female knights moving through the lower floors. Some pausing at the Floor 8 spring to stand very still in the water with expressions of concentrated discomfort. The Floor 8 spring removed scars. The kinds of scars you carry for a long time. I had watched enough of those moments to stop watching closely. I was alone. I could pause my own consciousness the way PETA did and let the hours pass without existing. I had done it for the 79 hours Floor 8 took to build, but I had not done it this time, because when I switched off, there would be no one in the room at all. I sat with that. Then I did something I will not describe in detail. What I will say is that the monitoring system was still active, and the Floor 1 spring was very full, and I had confirmed that my body still worked the way it used to. PETA woke up on day 7. She surfaced into consciousness mid-morning, looked around, and then said, "What did you do?" It was not a question. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "There is something wrong with my wanting," PETA said. She sounded personally offended. "A strange desire I cannot name. Something I want and do not understand. You gave it to me. I needed to change the subject. I needed to do it immediately and without making it obvious that I was changing the subject." "What if," I said, "we built the 9th floor?" PETA went completely still. "Right now?" she said. "I was thinking," I said, already pulling up the construction interface. "Something open, wide. You mentioned you wanted more space. What if we made a floor that was just vast, like a field, a prairie?" she said. Her voice was doing something it had not done before. It was doing hope. "Enormous," I said. "Ceiling so high you can barely see it. No walls, just grass and sky and distance." The strange desire was forgotten. She forgot it with the speed and totality of someone who had never had it in the first place. She squeezed her eyes shut and said, "Yes, yes, do it. Do it right now." I did. The interface moved fast when I knew what I wanted. The 9th floor materialized in the construction queue. A single, vast expanse. No corridors, no traps, no architecture, just land. The ceiling rendered as open sky. The grass went to the horizon and kept going. When the timer cleared and the floor settled into being, PETA made a sound I had not heard from her before. She made a sound like someone who had been holding their breath for a long time. "I want to see it," she said. "I want to fly through it." She could project a phantom form, a conscious echo that could move through the dungeon while her core stayed in the master room. It cost 50,000 points per hour, roughly what a mid-sized dungeon earned in a full month. I looked at the point balance and decided her expression was worth it. "Go," I said. She went. Her phantom form shot through the grassland at impossible speed. A pale, winged shape against the false sky, the grass bending in her wake. She was too far away and moving too fast for me to hear what she was screaming. From context, I believe it was joy. Then I looked at the other monitors. There were 30 elite female knights on the 9th floor. They had been there for 3 days. The captain had split them into 2 groups with the intention of circling the floor and meeting on the other side. They had not met. After 3 days of walking with no reunion and no change in the landscape, the vice captain's conclusion was simple. This floor required numbers she did not have and supplies she could not carry. They were preparing to retreat. This was around the moment Peeta decided to fly toward them. She did not intend to disturb them. She was flying for joy, cutting great arcs through her new prairie, and the knights happened to be in the way of one of those arcs. She shot toward them, probably covering a kilometer in a few seconds, stopped about 100 meters short, and looked at them. The knight, with the sharpest eyes, saw her clearly. I watched the knight's face change on the monitor. She was a farm girl before she was a soldier. The 5th floor information spring had told me everything about everyone who had bathed in it, and she had bathed there 11 times. Nico, 23, raised cattle and chickens. She saw Peeta's eyes and recognized them, not because she had seen Peeta before, but because she had seen those eyes before, on her parents at the fence of the livestock pen, watching the animals with gentle, patient attention. The eyes of someone who had a use for you in mind and was in no hurry. Nico turned pale. She told the captain what she had seen. A winged girl, a demon, eyes like a farmer looking at livestock. I watched the captain process this. I watched her decide to retreat. Peeta, by this point, had already shot away in the other direction, unbothered, looping back toward the far end of her new floor with a kind of reckless happiness that involved no awareness of what she had left behind. I sat in the master room and thought, well, that is going to complicate things. The queen moved quickly. She stopped the official search. No more night battalions burning days and morale on a floor that defeated people with emptiness, and posted a bounty instead. 200 gold for a hot spring on the 9th floor, 300 for the stairs to the 10th. 300 gold would buy a small estate. Hundreds of adventurers entered. Most gave up inside 2 weeks. After a month, 2 challengers remained. A female thief found the 10th floor stairs approximately 3 hours after entering. They were immediately beside the 9th floor entrance. She sat down at the guard station, used her remaining breath to confirm the amount was 300 gold, and then cried for a while. The male adventurer did not come back. The guards filed the paperwork. I had placed the stairs where I placed them because the 9th floor was not designed to be explored. It was designed to be large. The dungeon's own mechanics consumed any marker left inside within days, converting foreign material into points, which made mapping impossible. The space was the point. Eventually, it would become something. For now, it was beautiful and useless, which is a valid thing to be. Peeta was delighted when the floor count hit double digits. She did not mention the strange desire again. I took this as a success and intended to keep it that way. Then, Ava Nasa found the 9th floor hot spring in 4 days. She had never entered the dungeon. I want to be clear about this because I keep coming back to it. She read the reports. Every report that had come out of the dungeon since the first 2 female knights stumbled out of the floor 1 spring with their skin transformed. She had been confined to her room for 10 years, while a disease left scars across her body. And in that decade, she had become one of the most thorough scholars of dungeon behavior in the kingdom. Her father had brought her the 1st floor spring water. It healed her limbs in a week. She cried in front of a mirror. Then, she looked at her sister's skin and decided that healing was not the same as complete, and went back to her reports. I knew some of this because the 5th floor information spring had files on her night associate, Vita, who had bathed there over 20 times. The file on Vita contained cross-references that led me to the name. I tried to pull Ava's own entry and found nothing. She had never set foot in the dungeon. I had assumed caution. I was wrong about the reason. She was not being cautious. She was being thorough, gathering data without contaminating herself with first-hand experience that might bias her conclusions. Here is what she noticed. There was no wind on the 9th floor. Vita had told her this in the expedition report. The grassland, 3 days of walking, no visible ceiling, no wind. This was the detail that mattered. A hot air balloon needs no wind. Wind is what makes it dangerous. Drift, loss of control. Remove the wind, and what remains is a stable ascending platform. From 3,000 meters up with a telescope, you can see 200 kilometers of grassland. You can find a hot spring. You can plot coordinates precisely enough to walk there afterward. Ava ordered a telescope cloth, and rope. She gathered craftsmen, built a balloon on the surface, carried it down in pieces, and reassembled it on the 9th floor. Then her team went up. I watched it from the monitor, a balloon rising inside my floor, ascending smoothly into the false sky, while PETA sat next to me and stared at the image without quite understanding what she was seeing. The scouts found the spring in hours. They measured, recorded, and withdrew without visiting the water at all. I had built that floor expecting years of exploration. I had imagined decades of organized expeditions, slowly triangulating the grassland by foot, drawing maps, collaborating across seasons, until eventually someone found what they were looking for. A woman who had never walked through my door had solved it in an afternoon. I pulled the name, Ava, third daughter of Duke Nasa, formerly ill, never bathed in floor 5, so her file was empty, her data locked. She had solved it from outside using secondhand reports and geometry. I noted the name, I kept it. She had done something that earned attention, and I paid it. The question of what to build next was not really a question. The 10th floor spring enhanced the rate at which the body learned from physical exertion. Real, genuinely useful, but invisible. Not something you could see in a mirror. It was not drawing crowds to the deep floors. I needed to give people a reason to descend all the way. I announced it to PETA one evening. 11th floor, I said. She made the face she made when she received very good news. Then she looked at the point balance. That is almost everything we have, she said. I know. We will have nearly nothing left. I know. After this, she said slowly. What? After this? I said. We stop. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I counted it. PETA sat very still, which she did not do often. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. Stop. For 2 years, I said. No new floors, no new construction. We build the 11th, and then we wait. Why? She said. The word had no inflection. It was not angry. It was asking genuinely. I had spent time looking at the night files, levels, physical parameters, the numbers the 5th floor spring fed back to me. The strongest of the female knights, who explored regularly, were good, trained professionals. But the dungeon was growing faster than they were. If I kept building, the 15th floor would start killing them, consistently, and a dungeon that killed everyone who entered it stopped generating points, became one of the silent ones, those vast ancient structures that sat in the world like monuments. Floors no one alive was strong enough to reach, deep springs untouched, points stagnant. The dungeon cannot outpace the people who walk through it, I said. If I keep building and they stay where they are, eventually no one reaches the deep floors. The dungeon becomes a ceiling no one can break. 2 years, long enough for the ones who come regularly to grow. PETA was quiet. Other dungeons, she said after a while. Yes, I said. I've been thinking about them. She nodded slowly. Not agreement exactly. Recognition. The 11th floor was not comfortable. I designed it that way on purpose. Enormous stairs, the kind where each step came to your knee and you had to push with your full body weight to lift yourself to the next one. Heavy stone doors that required 2 people to move. Sections where the path climbed the ceiling and you had to brace with your hands and feet and trust that the grip would hold. 3 days of it, according to the knights, who were the first to traverse it. They suffered. I watched them suffer on the monitors. The captain called an unscheduled rest at the midpoint because 2 of her knights had started vomiting from exertion. They sat on the dungeon floor and breathed carefully, in the way you breathe when you need the air but cannot waste any of it. The captain told them they had done well. She said it in a voice that meant she was telling them the truth, not comfort. They got up and kept going. At the end of 3 days, they found the spring. Protocol required the oldest knight to enter first. There had been an incident on floor 4, a 16-year-old who had stepped into the age reversal spring without prior testing and emerged as a child, which had caused significant administrative difficulty. The floor 11 spring needed a body old enough to test safely. Lena was 32, though she looked younger because of the floor 4 spring. She understood what the protocol meant, and she had made peace with it. She removed her armor and lowered herself into the water. She said, "Ah." Then she said it again. Then she stood up and said, "Captain, it's safe, and the effect is clear." She looked at the skin on her arms, then her hands. The way someone looks when they have been given back something they stopped expecting to receive. Enhanced version of the moisturizing spring from floor 6. Dramatically enhanced. And the fatigue, it is gone. I feel as though I have not walked at all. The knights moved toward the water with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for permission. What happened next was a very large number of battle-hardened women making sounds of profound relief in a hot spring while their skin did remarkable things. And I watched it with the quiet satisfaction of something going according to plan. Then the captain said, "Queen Sarah is going to see our skin tomorrow," and immediately say, "Take me to the 11th floor." The laughter died. Every night in the spring arrived at the same realization at the same moment. They had just traversed a 3-day physical gauntlet that had pushed them to the edge of their capacity. They were going to have to traverse it again and again and again, carrying nobles, guiding noble expeditions, managing noble complaints, explaining to noble ladies that yes, it is supposed to be this exhausting. The spring is at the end. The spring is worth it. Please do not stop here. The hot spring was still working on their skin. They sat in it, looking at their transformed hands. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. I let it run for a while, watching from the master room, privately satisfied. The dungeon was not just giving people what they wanted, it was building them toward what they would need. They would come back, these knights, as escorts and soldiers, and eventually as the kind of women who had done the 11th floor enough times that it stopped being a challenge, who had grown past the level where the 15th floor could kill them. 2 years. I just needed 2 years. The construction interface sat quiet. The point balance was low, nearly depleted, just enough to maintain what existed. Peta had stopped asking about new floors. She sat in the master room, looking at the monitoring feeds without speaking, which meant she was thinking. 11 floors, a prairie no one could map on foot, a training gauntlet, and a researcher who had never visited, who understood more about this dungeon's design than anyone who had walked its halls. I kept Ava's name and did nothing with it yet. The system would run, the knights would grow. Whatever came next would find them ready. I was technically failing at my purpose as a dungeon master. I was supposed to drain and take. I was building and giving. I could not find it in me to care. The food dungeon started dropping bread first. I found out the same way I found out about most things in those days, through the monitor, watching someone else react to something I had quietly set in motion. The no hunger dungeon was a separate operation, a partner arrangement, points for points, drops for drops, inter-dungeon commerce that neither of us announced to anyone. The food corps had been keeping the poor fed with dry loaves and cheap gemstones for years. Now the arrangement was bearing different fruit. Peta was asleep. I had the master room to myself, a bag of potato chips on the arm of my chair, a glass of cola fizzing warm beside it. On the monitor, a crowd was gathering near the food dungeon entrance, like someone had overturned a honey cart, which was, to be precise, exactly what was about to happen. I ate a chip and watched. Within a week, honey followed. Not wild honey scraped from cave walls and sold in waxed cloth. Precision-crafted glass jars with screw-top metal lids, airtight enough to hold water upside down without losing a drop. The kingdom had never manufactured anything like them. The jars were so perfectly made that even the seal mechanism, a threaded ring cut to tolerances that human craft could not match, attracted its own following of fascinated scholars who stood in the street sketching the lid from every angle. The honey hit the market, and the sweetener trade collapsed overnight. What had been a noble luxury, controlled by merchant houses who had built their entire financial architectures on the scarcity of sweet, was now available to anyone who could climb 3 floors of a dungeon. Poor children were buying new shoes with their honey earnings by the end of the 2nd week. Former dungeon residents who had become street soldiers were now guarding the better drops against monopoly grabs, which the noble houses attempted, and which went about as well as you would expect when the people doing the guarding had been fighting since childhood. I crumpled the chip bag and started on the cola. Peta woke up on the 3rd day of the honey chaos. She floated through the master room doorway, rubbed her eyes, and looked at the monitor. "Points are going up," she said. They are. She sat beside me. I had been working on her education systematically. Sweetness first, then salt, then the complex registers, and she had progressed faster than I expected. That afternoon, I showed her honey on bread, broke off a small piece, and she ate it with the careful concentration of someone analyzing a technical document. Sweet, she said, after a long moment. Good, not the same as the potato chip sweet. No, different source, different texture. Honey is... I looked at her face, which had gone from analytical to something approaching wonder, and decided not to explain the chemistry. Just eat it. She ate 3 more pieces. The wonder settled into satisfaction. Then she looked at the monitor again, where the points counter was ticking steadily upward, and she lit up the way she always did when the dungeon was working. Next drop, she said, sitting straighter. Candied sweet potatoes. No, her face fell. Why? Salt and pepper, I said. Lower floors, 6 and below. She stared at me. Salt and pepper. Salt and pepper. You are choosing powder over candied sweet potatoes. Salt preserves meat. Pepper makes it edible after a month of travel. The knights going deep into the dungeon need preserved food that doesn't rot on the descent. Salt and pepper solve that problem. Candied sweet potatoes do not. PETA looked at the monitor for a long moment. On screen, a group of poor children was selling honey from a basket, counting coins with the careful joy of people who had never counted this many coins before. She watched them. Some of her arguments visibly died in her throat. Fine, she said, but she said it the way someone says fine when they mean it is decidedly not fine. The salt drop happened 10 days later, and the kingdom reacted as though the dungeon had declared war on the aristocracy's lunch. Salt was not a seasoning in this kingdom. Salt was a power structure. Noble houses had been taxing it at the source for generations, collecting invisible money from every family in the capital. When the dungeon started releasing it on the lower floors, clean, white, precisely crystallized, in the same impossible glass jars as the honey, the price dropped by half in a week and kept going. On the monitor, one merchant sat down in the street and did not get up. Then the pepper arrived, and the queen had to cancel a meeting. I saw that meeting on the monitor too, in the peripheral feed from the dungeon's information network. The queen had been sitting across from a young noblewoman, the 3rd daughter of Duke Nossa, the one who had found the 9th floor spring with a balloon, and they had been having what looked like a very productive conversation. Then a messenger appeared, said 2 words, and the queen's expression shifted in a way that suggested the pepper had landed very precisely on something sensitive. The noblewoman did not seem bothered. She kept talking about the honey jar. The queen glanced at the door, then back at the jar the noblewoman was holding up, then at the door again. You were saying, the queen said, with the careful attention of someone calculating how long they had before they needed to leave, that the difficulty of transporting food is fortunate. The noblewoman set the jar down. I was. If the food came out in true quantity, every family fed indefinitely, effortlessly, within a generation. No one would remember how to farm. Agricultural science would stop. When the dungeon stopped, and all dungeons stop eventually, the population would have forgotten how to feed itself. The long stairs are not a flaw. They are the dungeon's gift. The queen stared at her. The dungeon, the queen said slowly, deliberately made the stairs inconvenient to protect our agricultural sector. I don't know if it is deliberate, but the effect is the same. The noblewoman picked up the jar and turned it toward the light. This lid mechanism, on the other hand, I want to reproduce it. The threading alone requires manufacturing tolerances that no existing forge in this kingdom can sustain. I have sketches. Would you like to see the sketches? The queen looked at the door. Another time, the queen said, I have to manage the pepper situation. Of course, but the threading. Another time, the noblewoman left still talking. The queen watched her go with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who has just found an extremely useful tool and is already planning how to keep it at arm's length. Back in the master room, PETA was in the kitchen alcove, surrounded by ingredients. I had given her a recipe book 3 days earlier, every dish I could clearly remember, organized by technique. She read the whole thing in an afternoon and declared she understood everything. I watched her dump an entire armful of root vegetables into a pot at once. PETA, I know what I am doing. You skipped the cutting step. She turned up the temperature, not to boiling, to something that would have vaporized the pot if the master room's materials were not immune to physics. The vegetables became something that had once been vegetables, philosophically speaking. The book says to cut them first, I said. The expression during the next hour of instruction was the expression of someone absolutely certain they already know this. allowing the lesson to continue only as a courtesy, but she got it. Small pieces, controlled heat, a long simmer. The third attempt came out nearly correct. Too much salt, because she had decided salt was interesting, but structurally sound. She tasted it, made a face that was heading toward satisfaction. Better, I said. I know. Meanwhile, on floor 11, the training was working. I had built that floor knowing exactly what I was building. The giant stairs, the ceiling sections, the doors engineered to be heavy. All of it was designed to do one specific thing to a human body over months of repeated traversal. The second unit knights had been going through it since completion, once a week, then twice, then on escort rotation, whenever a noble cleared the qualification threshold. They complained at every stage. They complained loudly to the empty dungeon, to each other, occasionally to the ceiling in a way that suggested they hoped the dungeon's will was listening. The dungeon's will was listening. It found this fairly funny. What was not funny was the data on the monitor. After 4 months, the veterans were completing the 11th floor measurably faster than new arrivals. Not from familiarity with the route, but because something in them had changed. The new arrivals arrived shaking. The veterans arrived tired, but functional. The gap widened with each rotation. One of the knights noticed. Nico, with the farm background, the same one who had recognized PETA's livestock watching eyes months ago. She pulled 3 veterans aside in the changing area and made them demonstrate the discrepancy. Then she turned to the group and said, with the flat certainty of someone reporting a field observation rather than a theory, "The dungeon is raising us." Nobody disputed this. They sat with it the way soldiers sit with difficult truths. I was drinking coffee, PETA's third attempt at coffee, which was the first one that had not vaporized on contact with air, and watching the monitor, and I thought, yes, that is exactly what I am doing. The first unit arrived at the end of that same month. They came back from the thread dungeon of the Dolphin Kingdom with a crate of strong silk cloth and the collective appearance of people who had spent months inside a large hostile stone structure, which they had. They were the Queen's best, and also, unknowingly, my first real test subjects. The noble ladies training in the palace plaza did not recognize them. The Count's daughter, working through her 30th lap with the grim determination of someone who wanted the 11th floor spring badly enough to suffer for it, looked up when the unit passed and simply did not connect the faces to anything she knew. 30 women in travel-worn armor, moving with the efficiency of people who had learned to conserve effort, walking past a training ground full of people conserving nothing. One of the first unit asked who the athletic field was for. The Count's daughter explained. The captain looked at the obstacle course, looked at the noble ladies, and said nothing. Then she led her unit to the palace. Queen Sarah received them in the throne room. She listened to the spoils report. She smiled at the captain with the precise warmth of someone who knows something the other person does not yet know and is enjoying the moment before the reveal. "You've earned a rest," the queen said. "There is something I want to show you." She sent them to the dungeon with Vita as their guide. I watched them descend through the monitor. The first unit's captain, Tori, 43 years old, data resolving on her 6th visit, moved with the contained efficiency of a combat veteran, scars at every joint, left hand favoring one side, right shoulder not quite reaching full elevation, the accumulated damage of someone who had spent decades in armor and learned to compensate so thoroughly that the compensations had become her baseline. PETA leaned over my shoulder and looked at the monitor. Her shoulder, PETA said. 9th floor spring. It will correct. Her hand too, her hand too. PETA looked at the captain on the screen for a long moment. Something in her expression had gone quiet and attentive, the same quality she had when she was cooking something carefully and did not want to rush it. The first unit moved through the floors quickly. Vita guided them past the crowded lower baths, explained the springs floor by floor with the efficiency of someone who had done this tour many times. On the 5th floor, a Black Panther emerged, the same respawn I generated from the master room's natural miasma, and Tori killed it with a single punch without breaking stride or changing her expression. On the 6th floor, there was a brief argument about the moisturizing spring. Tori's concern was practical. She had spent decades hardening her skin deliberately. Vita argued that softened skin enhanced grip and that durability in combat tests showed no change. The first unit's women watched this exchange with the stillness of people desperately hoping it would go the right way. When Vita said, quietly and precisely, that the grip improvement was actually a combat advantage, the stillness broke into something adjacent to relief. Tori relented. They entered. What happened in the following 10 minutes, I will not fully describe. These were women who had spent their careers giving up the appearance of their bodies, and the spring gave some of that back. Some of them laughed, some did not. Tori sat in the water and looked at her hands, and whatever she was thinking did not appear on her face. She was ready for the 9th floor 3 floors later. The grassland was in its full ordinary state, crops marking the route, grasses moving in the engineered breeze, the hot spring, a small stone circle visible from the path. The knights ate a meal on the 9th floor. Tori asked about the food situation, about the long stairs and the transport problem, and what the analyst at the Duke's mansion had concluded. Vita relayed what Ava had said, that the difficulty was intentional, or at least fortunate, and that Ava had made this point to the Queen directly. Protect her, Tori said, not as a request, as an order. Vita said nothing for a moment. Then, she is my mistress, Captain. I know. Protect her anyway. In the master room, Pita was on her 4th attempt at tanjiru. She had stopped oversalting. The vegetables were cut correctly. The broth was cloudy in the right way. I watched the monitor and listened to the sound of a ladle scraping a pot, and thought about the fact that I had a dungeon corps learning to cook soup, while 30 veteran knights were working their way down to the 9th floor to discover what it felt like when a decade of structural damage was undone in a single afternoon. Tori entered the spring first. She was in the water for almost 10 minutes before she moved. Then, she stood up slowly and she moved her left hand, all the fingers. She reached her right arm up, past her face, past where it had stopped going for longer than she could precisely remember. She opened her mouth. What came out was not words. It was the kind of sound a person makes when something they had made peace with not having is suddenly and completely returned to them. She stepped out of the spring. She was still making the sound. She started running across the grassland in the direction of nothing in particular, her arms out, her head back, performing acrobatics in the tall grass that were entirely inconsistent with the dignity of a 43-year-old combat captain. The first unit stood at the spring's edge and watched their captain sprint naked across a dungeon floor with what appeared to be joy. Vita turned to the nearest knight with the expression of a person who has been asked to explain something she does not entirely have words for. It seems, Vita said, that the captain enjoyed the hot spring. The knight said nothing. Several other knights said nothing. Somewhere in the middle distance, Tori performed a backflip. For the next 2 months, the first unit stayed. They ground the 11th floor methodically, carrying increasing loads because Tori decided that was the correct protocol, and the second unit was there as a benchmark. The second unit's reaction to the first unit volunteering to carry their packs while racing them to the spring was an experience I observed with interest. The veterans arrived ahead of the younger, unencumbered unit. Some members of the second unit did not arrive in a condition that could be described as dignified. The food dungeon crops were part of the cycle. Eat well, train hard. The 10th floor spring processed the training into something cumulative. The 11th floor spring recovered the body for the next session. The cycle compounded. Peta sat beside me and watched the monitor, and occasionally said something perceptive about a knight's movement pattern that I had not noticed. She made coffee correctly on the 7th attempt. Not vaporized. Coffee. I drank it, and it was good. Better, I told her. She looked extremely pleased with herself. The day the first unit walked back out, the noble ladies training in the plaza did not recognize them. This was the part I had not quite anticipated, not the transformation itself, but the specific texture of the moment when people who knew the first unit looked at them and simply could not connect what they were seeing to what they knew. The noble ladies stopped their laps. Someone recognized the unit insignia, and the silence spread outward in a wave. 30 women who had gone in looking like they had survived several wars came out looking like they had survived several wars, and also found something they had thought was gone. The surface scars were reduced. The 8th floor handled that. The deep ones remained as history. What was different was the frame underneath. Corrected, built, every joint moving through its full range because the 9th floor had given it back and the 11th floor had then used it. They were the same people. They were entirely different people. Tori walked into the throne room and the king laughed. Not a polite laugh. He laughed the way a person laughs when something bypasses the brain entirely and hits the lungs directly. 2 full minutes. His counselors looked at him, then at Tori, then back at him, and none of them found an appropriate response. Tori stood in the throne room with the patient dignity of a person who has decided in advance that this reaction is acceptable. When the king finally recovered, Tori made her request. Her unit was requesting extended leave from foreign dungeon assignments to continue training in the 10th floor spring. The thread and cloth they had brought back from the Dolphin Kingdom had already been traded for new equipment. She had heard the timeline was about 6 months for delivery. She was simply asking for that time to be spent in the dungeon. The king agreed without hesitation. Then, he turned to the second unit's captain, who was standing to the side of the throne room, and said that the second unit would be joining the training program as well. The second unit's faces in that moment contained several distinct emotions simultaneously. None of them were joy. Several were what I would characterize as a form of retroactive regret at ever entering the throne room that morning. Tori's face contained one emotion. She was looking forward to this. In the master room, I listened to Peta cooking behind me, something with shrimp and vegetables and thin batter, from a recipe embedded in her absorbed memories, smelling like nothing I could precisely name, and thought about the 11th floor, how I had built it in 48 hours, at the cost of nearly emptying the point reserve, how I had not announced its purpose, because purposes do not need announcing when the evidence will speak. The first unit had gone in, broken in the specific ways careers break bodies. They came out restructured. The king had now enrolled the second unit, without asking me or anyone who might have had a relevant opinion. The dungeon was a training ground. Nobody had asked the dungeon. The point counter was running. Peta's soup smelled good. I was still technically failing at my assigned purpose, still building instead of draining, still giving instead of taking. I could not find it in me to care. The training was over, Peta told me. She had been watching the monitor more than I had, tracking the knight's movements with the quiet attention I reserved for things I actually cared about. The second unit had cleared the 11th floor and headed for the surface. The first unit was already gone, dispatched on some international assignment the king had dreamed up. The thing I was watching was not the floors, it was the exit camera. Vita had come out of the dungeon, and she was walking wrong, not injured. Her stride was even, nothing broken, but her face was doing something I had not seen before. Still, not professional still. The kind of still that happens when a person's inner machinery has been running at full speed for so long that it just stops. She smiled when the household staff came to meet her. The smile did not reach her eyes. Ava met her in the entrance hall. I watched Ava's expression change the moment she saw it. Whatever she had expected, that was not what walked back through the door. She crossed the room fast, put both hands on Vita's face, and looked at her properly. "Rest," Ava said. "Sleep until you are yourself again. Nothing else matters." Vita slept for 3 days. Ava looked in on her twice, once in the middle of the night when no one was watching. The dungeon gives results. The results had cost something real, and Ava was the only one in that household who fully understood what she had been asking her aide to go through. I kept that thought. Things built to transform have edges. Edges cut. Meanwhile, Queen Sarah had been making use of what the dungeon produced. She sent the first unit to Mappenware Kingdom. They had visited 5 other courts on the way, and by the time Tori walked into King Sod's audience room, the word had already been running ahead of her. The Queen of Mappenware stopped moving when she saw them. Whatever she had expected, soldiers, women in armor, she got 12 people who looked like they had been put together by someone with more care than anyone in this world had a right to expect. "Can we purchase the water?" That was the queen. Tori answered with her usual economy. First floor water could be exported. Deeper floors required a visit. The queen looked at her king. The king looked at his secretary. That evening, Queen Sarah's letter arrived. Polite, very clear. The hot spring dungeon of Sapans was prepared to receive foreign guests. Queen Sarah had turned her knights into the most efficient diplomatic instrument in the kingdom's history. Nobody had asked me. I found I did not particularly mind. The point income had been accumulating nicely. I had been thinking about the gem situation. Most of the good gems were registered to the Kenma Kingdom's gem dungeon. I contacted their core. Peta handled the connection, and the master turned out to be a 19th century British gem merchant who had died of lung damage from gem dust. He did not know about the ideal cut. That invention came after his time. I traded him the technique for exclusive rights to 4 gem varieties his dungeon had not yet registered. He was delighted. He spent the rest of the meeting ignoring his dungeon core, Tanya, a voluptuous brown-skinned demon covered in jewels, who was deeply unimpressed with both of us, to study the demonstration stone I gave him. It was not a diamond, it was cubic zirconia. He could not tell the difference. I kept that to myself. But the gem dungeon meeting was still being arranged when something else arrived first. Peta looked up from the stove with her head tilted. "Master, another dungeon core wants to speak to you." "Which dungeon?" Her expression did something complicated. "The armament dungeon, the world's largest." A moment later, someone appeared in the master room. He was small. He looked about 9 years old, a boy demon with sharp eyes and a ridiculous amount of equipment strapped to his compact frame. Swords on his back, a breastplate that was probably worth more than most kingdoms, gauntlets with too many buckles. He looked exactly like what you would get if you gave a very small child the entire contents of an armory and told him to express himself. He surveyed me like he was doing me a considerable favor. "Yo!" His voice was high and confident. "You're the food dungeon master from Seppens? Heard you've been doing well. Good thing you got yourself a human master like us, right?" He grinned. "I'm the Armament Dungeon Corps, world's largest. Remember it." Peta, behind me, had gone very still. She was deciding whether to cut the connection. "Noted," I said. "How did you get big enough to be the largest?" He blinked. He had expected more reaction to the announcement. And then, because he was the kind of person who cannot resist explaining how smart he is, he sat on the edge of the monitoring table and told me. "Weapons, armor. Every adventurer in the world needed them, so the demand never stopped. He had built a dungeon around the one thing everybody had to have, pushed it to 27 floors, and stopped only when human limits caught up with him. No one's going deeper," he said. The confidence dropped slightly at the edges. 27 is the end. What's on the 27th floor? He pulled a book from somewhere in his armor and showed me a sword design that could best be described as every dramatic element from every battle story, assembled into one blade without a gram of restraint. He had given the thing a name I will not repeat. "It's the ultimate sword," he said. "It looks like it." I kept my expression neutral. He watched me very carefully to determine if that was agreement or something else. What changed the whole meeting was Peta. She had been making coffee, and she brought 2 cups over with the specific satisfaction of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. The smell reached him before the cup did. His nose lifted. "What is that?" "Coffee," Peta said. She did not offer him any. He tracked the cup the way I track a monitor on a slow day, the focused attention of something bored that has suddenly become not bored. I put the manga on the table. I had been making it from the Knight's own battle records. 2 months of first unit combat footage, actual documented movements, the way Tori fought, the way her unit adapted. I had taken those records and done what anyone from my world would do with good source material. Illustrated sequential panels, dramatic angles, the visual grammar that makes a battle feel real. He picked it up, ready to dismiss it. He read the first page, then the second. He stopped talking. The expression shift, the specific moment when someone who was ready not to care realizes they absolutely care, and it is too late. I have seen it happen to people. I had not expected to see it happen to a dungeon core. Peta quietly set a cup of coffee next to his elbow. He picked it up without looking. He drank it without tasting it. His eyes did not leave the page. He read for a long time. When he finally looked up, the swagger was different. Still there, but rearranged around something new. He wanted more. He was not going to say it directly, too much dignity, but it was in every line of his face. His finger tapped the last page once. The name. "I will call you Sen," short for onsen. Peta made a sharp sound. The sound meant, "Do not accept this without understanding what it means." "A soul bond," she explained. "Weaker than a true name, significantly weaker, but a bond. A thread of connection that would eventually let him experience what I experienced. Taste, for instance." He watched me think about it with the patience of someone very confident about the outcome. "All right," I said. "Sen is fine." He grinned. A genuine one, that time. Then, he gathered every volume I had made, tucked them into his armor with mechanical efficiency, and stood. "I will return when I have read these. Bring what you know about metallurgy," I said. "I am curious." He considered this. Then he left, without paying, Peta noted, with feeling, and the connection closed. I sat in the quiet that followed, and made a note in the back of my thinking, where I keep things I do not say. The steam engine, the industrial chemistry. He would want those eventually, and offer things for them. Those were not for trade yet. He was genuinely interesting. He was also, as of today, partially mine. Forge. I decided to call him. It fit. The soap situation I mostly watched from the monitoring room. The foreign princesses arrived in a wave. They came with large entourages, significant expectations, and the absolute certainty that wealth could solve any problem, including physical fitness, which the 11th floor disabused them of immediately. Not one foreign noble completed a single lap of the training course. They looked at the Sipon's women running it and went very quiet. Floor 6, they could reach. Floor 6 was managed by Stretcher. The 12th floor soap was the discovery that mattered. It was very good soap. The fragrance lasted weeks, the odor removal was permanent, and it was available in the walls, which the knights mined like ore and sold at the palace with the calm satisfaction of people who had done genuinely difficult things and now found this comparison easy. The king auctioned the first batch. Princess Glida of Kema doubled every bid until she won all of it. I watched her butler's face go through stages of emotion he was too professional to express. The king took the proceeds and enrolled more squires in the training program. The 13th floor I had designed for its mirrors, flat and clear and exact, better than anything this world produced. When the knights walked in and saw themselves perfectly reflected, they stood in silence for a moment. Then they cut the mirrors out of the walls with their swords and carried them home. The mirrors regenerated. The knights did not know that yet. Ava received a piece no larger than her hand, held it up, and went still. She had been afraid of her own reflection once, before the first floor spring healed her. The perfect mirror found the last trace of that fear and put it in plain view. She looked at herself for a moment. Then she set the piece down and started measuring the dimensions to calculate transport capacity per stretcher. That was Ava. She filed things. Then she moved on. The paper arrived in my awareness indirectly, as an effect, before I understood the cause. She had been studying the dungeon's products for months. Soap, bread, honey in a jar, with a precision-threaded lid no craftsman here could replicate. Glass of a clarity that should not exist yet. Chocolate, whose consistency suggested manufacturing too stable for human hands. The gems, cut with precision, matching the Kenma dungeon. But the Kenma master was from the 1800s and did not produce food. No single source in this world could hold all of this knowledge. No genius could have invented all of it independently, because each domain required a completely different body of accumulated expertise. Unless it came from a place where all of it already existed, refined over centuries, embedded in ordinary life so thoroughly that even someone who knew none of the underlying science still knew all the results. Ava wrote a paper. She sat at her study table with the products laid out and reasoned from each one to the same conclusion. Then she put that conclusion into clear language and sent it to the dungeon researchers she had been corresponding with since her years of isolation. The paper said, "The dungeon's will does not originate from this world. It comes from the future or from somewhere else entirely." She was right. She had reasoned to the correct answer from soap and bread and a jar lid without ever entering the master room. She had built the truth out of products I had dropped because they were the things I knew how to make. I sat with the monitoring screen on, watching the room where she had written it. She was already on the next report, the mirror's dimensions, the 13th floor's hair removal effect, its estimated market value. She was going to spend her life figuring out what I was. I could see that life from here, stretching in the direction of this dungeon, every piece of work oriented toward one eventual conversation. I could not tell her I was listening. I kept watching. The king had a problem. The Dungeon Museum had been managed for 40 years by a director assigned to the role because someone had to do it. For 40 years, the dungeon had not grown, the exhibits had not changed, and the explanatory cards had remained accurate in the way a stopped clock is accurate twice a day. Now the dungeon was the most important thing in the kingdom, and foreign royalty was complaining about the descriptions. He summoned Vita. Vita was on holiday. Her expression when the summons arrived said everything she could not say. She reported to the palace and confirmed. Ava was unemployed, studied at home, no current obligations. Tell her the museum needs someone to rewrite the exhibits and research the dungeon items, the king said. The director handles administration. She handles the knowledge. Vita returned to the mansion and delivered this. Ava's response was to look up from her work and say very carefully, "I can rewrite them however I want, within reason." "Yes," Ava said, "I accept." What followed was the museum negotiation, which Vita described to no one afterward because there was no one to tell, but needed to say somewhere. Ava had arrived at the museum with a contract already prepared. The The director, a man with no interest in dungeons who had been assigned the role for administrative convenience, had agreed to it, 20% of earnings from her research as her operating budget, because that had seemed reasonable until Ava, in the same meeting, casually mentioned the 13th floor's hair removal effect and estimated its revenue potential. 20% of what that water could earn was a number that made the contract look completely different when you held it up to the light. The director smiled. Ava smiled. Vita stood near the wall with the look of someone watching a transaction she did not fully understand, but suspected she should have stopped. They brought the contract to the king. He read it, several stages. Then, cancel it. I will give her a proper research budget from the state, whatever she needs. Cancel this immediately. Your Majesty, Vita said carefully. Why am I being scolded? I did not sign anything. The king stared at her. The question was not wrong. He redirected his attention to the contract and told it what he thought of museum directors who signed research agreements without consulting the palace. He allocated a budget, larger, by all accounts, than what 20% of hair removal water would have generated anyway. Vita delivered the news. Ava received it with the expression of someone who had expected something like this and was already thinking about what to buy. When do I start? Ava asked. Apparently, whenever you are ready, Vita said. Ava was already making a list. She would spend the rest of her career in that museum, revising what the kingdom understood about the dungeon from the outside. She had a theory. Now she had a platform, a budget, and state authority to pursue it. The dungeon is supposed to drain adventurers. That is the design. Ava had just been appointed to officially study everything I was doing wrong. I made Peta a cup of tea and watched the point totals tick upward. Tomorrow, Forge would want more chapters. The gem dungeon would want to renegotiate. The foreign princesses would want soap. And somewhere in the museum, a researcher who had reasoned her way to the truth would be writing the first exhibit card in a new direction. All of this somehow was my fault. I could not find it in me to care. The idea came to me at breakfast. The hot spring dungeon ran on miasma. The food dungeon ran on miasma. Both were mine. And the steam from the hot springs, that was dungeon miasma turned into vapor, dissolved in water, concentrated by heat. What happened when that steam touched food? I proposed the idea to Peta. She was already halfway through a diagram before I finished speaking, which told me she had been thinking the same thing and was waiting for me to catch up. We ran the first experiments quietly. Baskets of vegetables suspended over the steam vents on the 14th floor, covered and left to cook in the vapor. Simple, just heat and miasma and time. The citrus tea was first. Dried peel, roasted barley, steeped in hot spring steam. We gave a cup to one of the knights who had stayed on the research team. She drank half of it, set the cup down, and started reading a recipe card posted on a wall across the room. The recipe was written small enough that I had trouble reading it myself from my monitors. She read it aloud without moving closer. That was the moment I understood what we had found. The second test was steamed corn. That was Vita's batch. She ate an ear at noon. For roughly the first 40 seconds after, she was moving at twice the speed of everyone around her. She ran across the cooking floor, stopped, stared at her own hands, made a noise that was somewhere between a scream and a question, ran back, and then ran straight through the door into the hallway because she misjudged the distance. The knights on the research team scattered. Everything looks wrong, Vita said from somewhere in the hallway, speaking very fast. Why is everyone so slow? Am I going to be like this? About 40 seconds, I said, watching the monitors. 40 seconds until what? Until it stops. A pause. Then, how do you know it stops? Because I made it stop, I said. Temporary buffs. I set them to wear off. You are not stuck. The 40 seconds passed. She came back through the door at normal human speed, sat down in the nearest chair, and looked at the half-eaten ear of corn on the table in front of her with an expression I could only describe as complicated. The knights who had scattered came back one by one. Nobody volunteered to test the next batch. Peta was delighted. She had been watching through the monitors from the master room and could not stop laughing, a small, silent, shaking kind of laughter that I noticed only because she kept bumping into the table. Over the following days, the research team compressed the buff foods into concentrated forms. The citrus tea reduced to a single sip vial. The speed corn dried and powdered and sealed into small paper packets. The casual cooking atmosphere of the experiment became something more systematic and serious. But the underlying fact remained. The dungeon's hot spring steam when used to cook food, transferred the magical properties of the spring into whatever the steam touched. I had expected enhanced flavors. I had not expected combat enhancement. The dungeon was not just a beauty destination or a food drop or a training gauntlet. It was becoming a pharmaceutical laboratory that nobody had signed a waiver to work in. I decided I was fine with that. The whiskey appeared at the start of a state banquet, which was the best and worst possible timing depending on who you were. Sake had already been part of dungeon life for weeks. The food dungeon dropped it in paper packs, sealed tight enough that the aroma did not escape until you opened them. King User had deployed a significant portion of the national army to collect it from the dungeon floors, and for 2 weeks, the food dungeon was more popular than the hot spring dungeon. I found this gratifying in the same way I found everything in this story gratifying, quietly, with the awareness that I was still failing to drain a single adventurer. But the whiskey was something else. Sake had given this world a reference point for good alcohol. Whiskey gave them no reference point at all. A soldier ran in from the dungeon access with the bottle, barely out of breath, already carrying the expression of a man who had decided that delivering important news loudly was the safest interpretation of his job. The banquet hall went still. The bottle was passed up the table. King User examined it. He turned it in his hands. He looked at the amber color through the glass. He said that as king, it was only right that he taste it first. Nobody disagreed, which was the first mistake. He drank it straight. The second mistake, the king of Sepin's kingdom, ruler of the dungeon that had produced this bottle, choked so completely and for so long that the court physician was summoned at a sprint. The banquet hall was evacuated, and the soldier who had brought the news was briefly detained on the grounds that poisoning seemed like the most logical explanation. The soldier was released the next morning with apologies. The physician confirmed that the king had simply encountered an alcohol content that his throat had never been asked to manage before. The king spent 3 days not telling anyone what had actually happened. Peta and I watched the whole thing through the monitors. I had a bowl of snacks. She sat next to me with her feet tucked up under her and ate the snacks in the specific way she ate things when she was not going to admit she found something funny. He drank it straight, she said. He did, in front of everyone, at a banquet, I confirmed. She ate another piece of whatever she was eating. That is his own fault. Completely, I agreed. The dungeon had done what it always did. Drop something into this world with no instructions and let the world figure it out the hard way. Queen Tata of Mappenware arrived in the kingdom with the patience of a woman who had waited a long time for something she was owed. She was not thin. She had never been thin. The court life of a queen produced a particular kind of body, not from indulgence exactly, but from specific foods, specific postures, specific stresses. She was plump in the way that is not a choice. She had heard what the dungeon did to the foreign princesses, and she had demanded access with a degree of urgency that by the time it reached King User's desk, had the character of a royal decree. Tori carried her through the obstacle course on the 11th floor. The queen was not going to attempt the course herself, and Tori was the strongest person in the dungeon, so Tori carried her, professionally and without commentary, while the Mappenware Knights watched with the expressions of people who had spent several weeks managing a very difficult situation and were grateful someone else was handling it now. Over several days, Queen Tata went through the floors. I watched through the monitors. Quality assurance, I told myself. The rejuvenation springs on the 4th took 3 years off the visible evidence of her age. The long soak on the 9th addressed structural tensions she probably did not know she was carrying. She went through all of it with the focused attention of someone who had come here for a result and intended to get it. On the 13th floor, the hair removal spring finished what the earlier floors had started. On the 11th, the floor with the bath that did not make you thinner, but made you the best version of whatever your body actually was. She went in, she came out. I took several screenshots. This is not something I am proud of, but it is what happened. The dungeon's springs are not diet tools. They do not slim. They correct what is structurally wrong and enhance what is naturally present. For Queen Teta, the plumpness she had lived with all her life was no longer at odds with the rest of her. Everything came into balance. The body she had always had became the body she was clearly meant to have. The court was silent when she appeared at the night banquet, not the silence of polite surprise, the silence of people recalibrating. The queen stood in the center of it and was satisfied in a way that moved through her whole posture, the satisfied stillness of a person who has gotten exactly what they came for. I was watching this on my monitor in the master room. Peta appeared next to me with a bowl of ramen she had made, set it down, and waited for me to notice it. I did not immediately notice it. "Master," Peta said, "one moment. Your ramen is here. Just a moment." A pause. "You have been watching for quite a long time." "Quality assurance," I said. She made a sound that was not agreement, not disagreement either. The specific sound of a person who has decided to let something pass, but wants you to know they are letting it pass. I ate the ramen. It was very good. When I glanced at Peta, she was looking at her own bowl with an expression I chose not to try to read. Tori's 5-year contract was formalized that week. She had been living in the dungeon for months already. The contract was the kingdom acknowledging a reality that already existed and attaching a number to it. I approved the dungeon expansion and felt the quiet satisfaction of something built without a plan turning out to be useful. Ava's solar weapon nearly blinded 3 people. I found out from the reports 3 days after the incident. What she had done was assemble the 13th floor mirrors into a focusing array. The physics worked exactly as physics was supposed to. The mirrors concentrated sunlight into a point of heat intense enough to set a courtyard wall on fire in under a minute. The 3 people recovered fully. The king shut the experiment down the same afternoon. Ava looked at the mirror array she had built, thought for approximately 4 minutes, and repurposed the entire design into a lighthouse reflector. The principle was identical. The mirrors focused light in an uncontrolled field in daylight that produced a weapon that was both dangerous and impractical. Torches and fire arrows existed and were easier. In a lighthouse tower facing out to sea at night, it produced a navigation beacon that could be seen from twice the previous distance and held its beam in conditions that would have defeated any flame. The king saw the first demonstration and ordered every lighthouse in the kingdom upgraded with dungeon mirrors before the week was out. He also declared the mirrors a controlled royal commodity, which meant private purchase required a sum that approximately no one outside a treasury could pay. Ava's research budget increased significantly. She filed the solar weapon idea under a heading in her notes that translated roughly as interesting but impractical for now, and moved on. I watched from the master room and felt the particular pleasure that comes from watching someone turn a failure into something better than the success would have been. Ava was already past it. The lighthouse reflectors were behind her before the funding came through. She was looking at the 14th floor boiling water and thinking about what happened when you mixed it with the scar-correcting spring from the 8th. She was going to get there eventually. I just had to be careful about how much of the road I cleared for her. Tanya arrived in the master room on a quiet afternoon when Peta and I were making okonomiyaki. Forge had been messaging through the Soul Connection about the next manga volume. Peta was managing the iron griddle. I was handling the batter and watching the monitors. Into that came Tanya through the spatial distortion, and with her the Mappenware weapon core, an older figure with the bearing of a very old gentleman who had ended up in an unexpected century and found it mostly agreeable. Tanya looked around the master room, the iron griddle, the batter bowl, and the okonomiyaki tools, the melon soda Forge had left from his last visit, the planning board with the 14th floor steam diagram on the wall. "How far ahead are you?" she asked. It was not really a question. She already knew. The Gem Dungeon Corps had been watching human commercial behavior for over 50 years. The precision of the food dungeon's outputs, the light optics of the mirror applications, the fermentation knowledge embedded in the sake. She had been adding it up for a while. I thought about it for a moment, not about whether to answer, about how. "Far enough," I said. "Future world or different world?" "Both," I said. "Different world, more advanced era." Tanya considered this. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who has confirmed a diagnosis they had been expecting for months. The expression is not relief exactly. It is the quieter thing, the settling of something uncertain into something known. "I want to see how you sold gems," she said. "The display, the arrangement, how your world made people want to buy them. That I could do." I closed my eyes and pulled up the memory of a jewelry shop I had walked past every Thursday on my way to the station in my old life. Glass cases with angled lighting, small diamonds on velvet, price tags, the specific spacing between pieces that created desire through proximity, close enough to see detail, far enough apart that nothing competed with anything else. I summoned it into the master room, a full display case, reproduced exactly. Tanya walked around it slowly. She stopped at the pricing. She studied a small diamond solitaire, the kind of ring that was unremarkable in my world, mass-produced, available in every shopping district. The labor, she said quietly, to cut this small, this precisely. My world had machines for that, I said. I know. She was still looking at the ring. I have been cutting these by hand for 40 years. She stood there for another minute. Then, she straightened up and promised me gem knowledge in exchange. The full technical vocabulary of what stones existed in this world, their properties, the cutting angles that brought out particular colors in the dungeon's artificial light. It was a fair trade. The Mappenware Weapon Corps ate 2 portions of okonomiyaki and said it was quite good. Tanya accepted a portion she did not eat, but held. They both left. Forge's soul connection pulsed with a request for Volume 4. Your secret is not much of a secret anymore, Peta said. She was cleaning the griddle with the careful attention she brought to anything she had cooked on. No, I said. Does that bother you? I thought about it honestly. The Dungeon Core network was small. Information moved slowly through channels that did not connect easily to human intelligence. And Tanya's trust was worth more than a secret, becoming less secure by the month. The sake packaging, the okonomiyaki tools, the mirror optics had all been breadcrumbs. Ava had found the seams from the outside with a paper carton and a theory. Tanya had found them from inside with 50 years of commercial observation. The most advanced knowledge was still mine. The industrial processes, the germ theory, the steam dynamics. Those I was not sharing, not yet. Not until I understood this world well enough to know what would help and what might accelerate something I had not predicted. It does not bother me, I said. Peta nodded. She set the clean griddle aside and sat down across the table from me, feet tucked up under her, the way she sat when she was comfortable. The monitor on my right showed the lighthouse at the kingdom's southern coast, the new mirror array installed and aimed out to sea. The point counter on my left ticked steadily upward. Foreign knights, research teams, the Mappenware Queen's retinue, Tori's unit running training circuits on the lower floors. Still building, still giving. The dungeon was supposed to drain the people who came into it. Somewhere in the original architecture of whatever this role was, there was a design intention about that. I watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the dark water and thought, not yet. Peta pushed a cup of citrus tea across the table to me. I picked it up. I did not take my eyes off the lighthouse. Thank you, I said. She said nothing, but she was looking at the same monitor I was, and she did not look irritated anymore. The dungeon was becoming something I had not planned for. I had built it with a specific purpose. A hot spring that healed, a food floor that fed, a research program running quietly beneath everyone's feet, a machine, a useful, functional machine I controlled from the master room, while Peta sat across from me, eating whatever she had decided to make that day. That was the design, but machines do not grow chickens. It started with a complaint, which is how most of my ideas start. The adventurers coming through the food dungeon floors were low on protein. Grain was everywhere. Vegetables were everywhere. But meat dropped rarely, and the gaps were showing up in their stamina during long sessions on the deeper floors. I spent 2 days trying to create a pig, then a cow. Both times the dungeon's mana refused. Too complex, too much biological intelligence to hold in form. The dungeon could not build them from nothing and keep them running. Chickens, it turned out, were right at the edge of what was possible. The first squad encountered them on the 9th floor and immediately reached for their bows, which was one approach. They brought 3 down before someone said the obvious thing aloud, that live chickens would produce eggs. This realization led to a 20-minute spectacle of armored knights attempting to catch birds on foot in a dungeon corridor. The chickens were not fast by any absolute standard. The knights in full plate were slower. The combination produced what I can only describe as a controlled chaos exercise with significant dignity cost. They also found the canned meat I had dropped alongside the chickens. The cans had a pull tab. The design was simple. The squad stared at the pull tabs for approximately 4 seconds, then cut the cans open with swords. I watched from the master room and said nothing. They got the meat open. The method worked. The salt-seasoned processed meat inside was extremely popular. I found out later that Ava had figured out the pull tabs by the second can. The squad's mortification upon learning this was, according to Vita's report, significant. The chickens were released into the 9th floor. They ate the grain crops. They laid eggs. The eggs hatched. Then they reproduced again. PETA came to me with this information in the tone of someone reporting a natural disaster. Dungeon creatures don't breed, she said, hands flat on the table, the way she sat when something had genuinely unsettled her. They come from miasma. They respawn. They do not lay eggs and make more of themselves. I told her that the hot spring dungeon's plants reproduced by seeds. The grain grew, went to seed, dropped, and regrew. That had always been the case. Plants are different, are they? She looked at me for a long moment. Then, she looked down at my stomach with the focused expression of someone cross-referencing a theory. Hey, she said, while I was unconscious, did you secretly lay eggs? I told her very clearly that I had not laid eggs. You seem very confident about that. Because I am confident about that. I cannot lay eggs. I am not biologically capable of laying eggs. She considered this with the expression of someone who had not fully decided whether to believe it. We allowed the chickens to keep reproducing. The dungeon's mana net was wide enough to sustain them. Living organisms introduced from outside, running on real biology, sustained by the miasma, but not controlled by it. I authorized the reproductive loop formally because there was apparently a toggle for it that I had never used, and the chickens multiplied. The 9th floor of the food dungeon now had a functioning population of birds. They lived in the grain fields. They did not bother the adventurers. The adventurers did not always bother them back, especially after eggs became reliably available. The dungeon had become a farm. The asphalt road appeared the morning after the first hut disappeared. The knights had built it on the 9th floor's open grassland as a test. Crude wooden structure, materials hauled from the surface. Ava had told them that stationary foreign objects began to break down after 2 days, and she was right. On day 2, the hut was gone, but the ground where it had stood was different. Flat, dark, smooth. I had built the asphalt road overnight while they slept. Rails would have required iron specifications and iron costs I had not budgeted for. Asphalt was simpler. The resulting surface was not precisely what I remembered from my previous life, but it was smooth and load-bearing. When Ava received the sample, she concluded immediately that the dungeon's will had responded to her letter about the mobile inn plan. She was not wrong. She was more right than she knew. Tori's unit dipped wheel components in the 16th floor's enhancement spring and built the first mobile container, an iron box with spikes along the exterior to deter monsters, and a heat transfer system inside that kept a small bath tank warm. They moved it 13 meters per day along the asphalt road, exactly as Ava's calculations specified, and it held. Permanent habitation on the 9th floor began in the 2nd week. The knights set up sleeping arrangements inside the container. Some researchers followed with cots and equipment. The food supply was reliable. The temperature was stable. The miasma acted as an atmospheric regulator at this depth. People moved in. I watched from the master room and thought, this was always where this was going. I had built a machine. The machine had become a village. Forge appeared the same week. He had been tracking the new metal tools moving through his own dungeon ever since Tori's unit started using equipment dipped in the 16th floor spring, and the butterfly knife Bug had shown him had sent him somewhere I recognized. The specific state of a craftsman who has seen something he cannot categorize and cannot stop thinking about. He materialized in his usual form, the small boy demon in the over-armored breastplate, and did not bother with a greeting. That knife material, he said. The handle, what is it? I told him it was aluminum. He did not recognize the word, which I expected. I reached into the point storage and pulled out 2 ingots, one aluminum, one duralumin, and set them on the table. He picked up the duralumin and turned it over. The expression on his face was recognition without framework, the specific confusion of someone whose expertise is telling them this is real, but cannot explain how. What is the formula? He said. Aluminum as the base, copper for hardness, a small amount of magnesium for stress tolerance. The ratios matter. I gave him the ratios. Approximate, not exact. The dungeon's mana filled the analytical gaps, and what I gave him was workable. He set the ingot down carefully. You bring change to stagnating dungeons, he said, finally. It was not quite a compliment. It was more like a statement of taxonomy, a category he was placing me in, the way you might note that a river has changed course. PETA slid a coffee across the table at him. He looked at it, looked at her, and took it without comment. The point reward he left behind when he departed was was equivalent to a royal procession visiting every floor in sequence. I sat in the master room after he was gone and watched the counter tick up and thought, approximate ratios, general knowledge from a previous life, and the dungeon did the rest. I was still giving, still building instead of draining. The irony continued to run. The 15th floor had been designed to repair. The miasma at that depth was dense enough to work on structural materials, not just biological tissue, but metal and fiber both. What went in broken came out whole. Torn cloth mended. Chipped knife edges returned to their original geometry. Dented armor found its original contours. Tori found it during an exploration session between training rotations and sent a standard report. New floor, stone benches, drying racks, single hot spring. The unit tested everything they had that was damaged and worked through it methodically, the way Tori's unit did everything, with the careful documentation of people who had been going first into every new space the dungeon created. At the end of the session, Vita noticed a cloth hanging on one of the drying racks. It had not been there at the start of the survey. Tori unfolded it. She read it. The report that reached the master room's monitoring system was not a combat report. It was a transcript. Tori had copied the letter out in full before bringing the cloth to the surface, because she was the kind of person who understood that things in the dungeon had a way of disappearing. The letter was from Ava. It was addressed to the dungeon's will. I read it slowly. She thanked the dungeon for what it had given her, not in vague terms. She was specific, in the way she was specific about everything. The skin disease she had carried since childhood, the way it had covered her shoulders and arms and most of her back. The years before the dungeon opened, when she had understood very clearly that she was going to spend her life in rooms because the world outside rooms was not going to accommodate her. And then the first floor spring and the healing that took 3 days and changed the entire physical fact of her existence. She said she hoped the dungeon was watching her work. The lighthouse mirrors, the buff food research, the steam pump calculations she had not yet started but intended to. She said, without expectation of reply, whether they might find a way to talk someday. The dungeon's absorption system had flagged the letter automatically. Everything addressed to the will was flagged. It had come through the monitoring record like any other document, a data entry, a timestamp, a floor designation. I read it twice. I did not delete it. The honest answer to why is this. The dungeon was built on a premise that has always embarrassed me slightly. The original design was not noble. The hot springs had a specific intended audience, and that intention was not respectable. What the dungeon became was not what I planned. It healed a woman who had been sick her entire life. It trained the kingdom's best fighters. It gave an engineer the resources to build a lighthouse. It became a place people lived. I did not plan for any of that. Ava's letter was the proof that it happened anyway, that underneath the point counter and the daily absurdity of running a dungeon, something had reached someone. She did not know it reached me. I could not tell her. The gap between the dungeon's will and the woman in the research room writing equations was not crossable in any direction I currently had access to. I kept the letter. It sat in the record file with a timestamp and a floor designation and no annotation, just evidence. The dungeon had saved someone's life, and I could not make myself undo that, even if undoing it were possible. I sat in the master room for a while after that. The monitoring system moved on to other reports. I did not. The mail first night order came back on a morning when Pato was making crepes. They had been in the Iron Dungeon for years. The Iron Dungeon's exploration cap sat at the 24th floor for sustained operations. They had worked within that ceiling for the full deployment, and the ceiling had worked on them. Joints that had absorbed years of deep floor combat without adequate recovery. Bodies carrying the specific damage that accumulates when you are repeatedly hit hard and there is no healing spring waiting on the way back out. They entered the food dungeon looking like what they were. They did not immediately recognize Tori. To be precise, Tori was standing at the first junction of the 3rd floor, which she used as a staging area for incoming visits, and the returning male knights walked past her. They were looking for the captain of the 1st unit. Tori waited, with the expression she had when something amused her, but she was going to let it run a little longer. "I'm Tori," she said, eventually. "Behind me is Vita, the male knight captain, Hitu. looked at her, looked at Vida, looked back at Tori. "The hot spring does this," he said. Among other things, Tori turned and started walking. 3 baths set up for you. Age reversal on the 4th floor. Body correction on the 9th. Teeth on the 17th. Cavities handled at 9. Broken teeth require 15. One of the male knights in the back asked, with the specific casualness of someone testing whether they could get away with asking, if there was a spring that changed other things. Tori's unit turned in unison. The male knight reconsidered his question. They went through the bath protocol. I watched from the monitoring system, while PETA offered occasional commentary on the crepe batter she was adjusting. The two of us in comfortable parallel silence. He too and Tori talked while their units were bathing. He told her the iron dungeon ceiling, 26th floor, was the absolute bottom, but sustained operations maxed at 24. Deeper required equipment the Kingdom Smiths could not yet produce. Tori said nothing immediately. I could see her in the monitor feed, looking at the spring they were sitting beside as if doing a calculation. "We're working on the materials problem," she said, finally. "It won't be fast." After the baths, Tori asked for a sparring session. The male knights agreed with the comfortable confidence of people who expected this to be educational for the other side. One male knight squared up against one of Tori's unit, a woman who had been called something unkind before the dungeon and had trained every day since the hot spring program began. The match lasted 4 minutes. The female knight won, barely. I watched Tori's face in the monitor. She was looking at the result with the expression of someone adding a number to a calculation. "Years of training," she said to Hitu, loud enough that the room could hear it. "And they can match your men when your men are off guard and still finding their footing after years in iron. That is where we are." She was not wrong. The female knights had narrowed the gap significantly. They had not closed it. The gap was real. Tori was stating it plainly, without embellishment, the way she stated most things. "Not a victory speech," Hitu said. "No," Tori said. "A report." Hitu looked around the dungeon with the expression I had seen on other people when it finally resolved from a set of floors into something they understood. Not a resource, not a training tool, not a medical facility, but all of those things simultaneously, built into something that had been running quietly while they were away. "What is this place becoming?" he said. Tori looked up at the general vicinity of the monitoring system's position, which she had always seemed to know somehow. "Ask the dungeon," she said. "It's been keeping better track than any of us." I watched the feed and said nothing. The point counter ticked on the left side of my display. The dungeon's population on the 9th floor showed 11 permanent residents. The food ecosystem was running. The asphalt road was holding. The letter was still in the record file where I had put it. The dungeon was load-bearing now. The machine had grown a life I had not designed, and I was watching it from the master room with Peta beside me, eating a crepe. And the irony of it was the same irony it had always been. I had come here with a very specific kind of intention, and the dungeon had decided to be something completely different. I could not find it in myself to object. The science started because of a towel. That is not how I would have framed it at the time. At the time, I would have said the science started because Beta arrived in my master room unannounced one morning, planted herself at my work table, and declared that she had a question and that I was going to answer it before she would leave. But the towel is what brought her. Tori's unit had left one at the Thread Dungeon. The Thread Dungeon sent someone to investigate, and Beta, who listened to dungeon core gossip with the focus of a woman who runs a kitchen and therefore knows everything, had heard I was explaining things to visiting cores and felt she had been passed over. "You taught the Threadmaster about soap," she said, "and you taught the Armor Corps about steel alloys." She set both hands on the table. "What exactly were you planning to teach me?" "You already know fermentation," I said. "You make alcohol." "I know that grain goes in and alcohol comes out." Her eyes narrowed. I do not know why. I looked at her for a moment. Then I told Peta to put on another pot of water because this was going to take a while. The lesson I had not planned to teach that day. Fermentation. What it actually is. Not the ritual of it, not the order of ingredients and the waiting, but the living mechanism underneath. The invisible organisms that consume sugar and excrete ethanol. The yeast that breathes in the dark of a sealed pot and makes something that humans call medicine or celebration, depending on the occasion. Beta listened the way she cooked, with total, focused attention and no visible emotion until the moment that the information landed, and then she had a reaction that she could not contain. The reaction reaction, when it landed, was profound disgust. "The alcohol," she said, very carefully, "is excretion." "Technically, yes." She looked at the cup she had been holding. She set it down with a precision that indicated she was controlling herself. "I have been serving excretion," she said, "for years. Humans ferment food constantly. Bread, vinegar, cheese, pickled vegetables, all of it is." "Do not tell me about cheese." She held up one hand. "Not today. We are discussing the alcohol." Peta, at the counter, was doing her best not to laugh. She was not entirely succeeding. The Black Cat Corps, Silk's companion, visiting with the Thread Dungeon Master, had been sitting at the edge of the room in complete indifference through the entire fermentation discussion. But when Beta said the word excretion, the Black Cat's ears moved. Her yellow eyes opened fully. She looked at the cup with an expression I can only describe as scientific. "We have a question," the Black Cat said. I waited. "When a wound closes over," she said slowly, "it forms a hard layer. We have observed this in the adventurers who use your springs. Our question is, what is that layer and why does it form?" Beta turned to look at the Black Cat with an expression that said very clearly that she was grateful to be discussing literally anything else. I explained platelets, the small pieces of blood that rush to a wound site and stick together to form a temporary seal, buying time for the deeper repair to happen underneath. The body's first responders, the biological scaffold that the skin eventually replaces from below. The Black Cat processed this with an attention that reminded me of how she examined everything, as if each fact was a piece of cloth being tested for tensile strength before being folded away. "Your springs accelerate this process," she said. "Yes. And the deeper springs do more. They don't just accelerate, they correct the repair's direction." The Black Cat said nothing for a moment. Then, she said, "Many cores have tried to replicate your springs. We have spoken with them. They failed." Beta's attention came back to the table immediately. The disgust about the alcohol was apparently shelved for the moment. "How many?" I asked. "We cannot give a precise count. Many. They produced water. They produced warmth. They could not produce the effect." The Black Cat tilted her head. "We believe they lacked the underlying knowledge. The water alone does not produce the cure. Your knowledge produces the cure. The water carries it." I sat with that for a moment. The most effective protection for the dungeon's uniqueness had never been secrecy. What protected it was the scale of what you would need to understand to replicate it. You could see that the spring healed skin disease. You could not deduce which biological mechanisms were being targeted, because those mechanisms were not part of this world's available knowledge. You would need to already know what I knew. Beta was still thinking about the failed copies. Her expression had shifted from disgust to something sharper. "They tried to steal it," she said, not asking. "They tried to reproduce it. That is stealing at a delay." She picked up her cup again, reconsidered, set it back down. "They should have asked you directly." The Black Cat's ears flicked once. In what I had come to understand was agreement. I told them about microorganisms, the invisible life responsible for rot and fermentation, and the souring of milk and the rising of bread, older than anything visible, doing its work in every pot and every body, regardless of whether anyone understood it. Beta listened to all of it. By the end, she had the expression of someone reckoning with a fact that changed the shape of everything she already knew. "So when I adjust the fermentation conditions," she said, "I am adjusting the conditions for an invisible population. Yes, I am farming them. In a sense?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to think," and got up and left, taking neither the cup nor the question about cheese. She did not say goodbye. I understood. The Black Cat watched her go, then looked at me with those yellow eyes and said nothing. It was a productive morning. The ice appeared on the lower floors without announcement. That was how Peta liked to introduce new things, apparently, by simply making them exist and then watching through the monitoring record to see who noticed first. Vita's unit noticed first. Her report that week described the new cold block, rectangular, heavy, stable only below the 4th floor, and causes adhesion to wet skin if touched directly, which one member of the unit had discovered in a manner the report described as uncomfortable and declined to elaborate on. What followed was the part of the report that I read twice. Vita had described the living conditions changes, cold drinks in the mobile residences, chilled fruit in basins of ice water, the heat of the lower floors made bearable by cooled air circulating through the habitation units. She had written it with the cheerfulness of someone documenting an improvement rather than a wonder, but the improvement was real, and I had put it there because I knew what heat does to people underground, and I wanted them to stay. After Vita's notes, there was in the intelligence summary, a brief line attributed to Ava. It said, "The dungeon's will appears to be actively supporting the habitation project." The ice arrived as the heat on the lower floors was becoming a concern for long-term residency. The timing is not coincidental. And then, below that, a sentence that she had apparently added as a personal note rather than an official observation. "I need to understand if the will is aware of us. I would very much like to speak to it directly." I read that line in the monitoring room with PETA asleep beside me. The dungeon was over 200 meters of rock and miasma and water and carefully designed floors, and somewhere above it, Ava was at a desk with ink on her fingers, writing that she wanted to have a conversation. She was right. I was aware. I had been watching her since the letter. I was aware of the ice timing. I had timed it. There was no channel. I had built the dungeon to speak through outputs, springs and drops and architecture. I could not write back. I could not knock twice on the floor of her study. The 200 meters between us was not just distance. It was the architecture of the system. I kept the summary. I did not delete the note. The dungeon was a machine I had designed for specific purposes, and a woman was asking it to be something else, something that could listen and respond. The fact that she was correct, that it was listening, did not solve the problem of what to do with that. PETA woke up and looked at me and asked, in a voice still fuzzy with sleep, if something was wrong. I told her I was thinking about the 19th floor. She accepted this and went back to sleep. The pressure drop on the first floor came without drama, which was the alarming thing about it. PETA noticed it first, not through the monitoring system, but through something more immediate, the dungeon's own sense of itself, which she described to me as feeling like a tooth starting to ache before the pain fully arrives. She said, "The spring on the first floor is losing pressure." I pulled up the monitoring feed and checked. She was right. The output rate was down, not catastrophically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone standing in the water, but real and measurable, and, once I had isolated the rate, accelerating. The cause took time to identify because I was looking inside the dungeon. I checked the miasma density. I checked the substrate. I found everything performing correctly. The spring producing exactly as much water as the floor's miasma should sustain. The problem was not production. The problem was extraction. Ava's steam pump had been pulling first floor spring water at a rate that the dungeon's engineers, which is to say, me, had not anticipated, because I had designed the dungeon's water systems for human-scale extraction. A line of women drawing water with buckets, a night unit with portable containers, the physics of human effort. I had not built a safety margin against a machine that generated dozens of times the force of human muscle, because a machine like that had not existed in this world when I designed the springs. It existed now. Ava had made it exist. The production rate of the spring was fixed. It had been running without issue for over a year. The steam pump was drawing faster than the rate could replenish. The spring that had healed Ava's skin. The spring that had stopped Lena from aging backward. The spring that had brought the first 2 nights down the first corridor and made the dungeon's reputation and started the entire chain of events that led to Tori living on the 9th floor and Forge trading metallurgy and Ava writing letters to the dungeon's will. That spring was now being drained by the tool that the dungeon's own design had made possible. I watched the monitoring feed for a long time. PETA sat beside me and said nothing. She understood what she was looking at. The dungeon was her home more than it was mine. She had no other. Her expression had the quality of someone watching water leave a bucket that they cannot reach to cover. "How long?" she said, eventually. "At the current extraction rate, I do not know the pump's schedule." I ran through the numbers. If it runs continuously, the spring starts showing visible symptoms within weeks. The deeper floors are unaffected, but the first floor spring is the entrance. It is what every visitor encounters first. It is what she encountered first, PETA said. Yes, it was. She had written that she wanted to speak to the will of the dungeon. The thing she most needed to hear right now was, "Please slow down the pump." I could not say it. What I could do was add floors 19 and 20. Disease-curing water on 19, drawn from a different vein of the dungeon's mana flow, entirely separate from the first floor's spring system. A rejuvenation bath on 20, with effects calibrated for the things I had been learning about this world's specific population of ailments. The things that the knights had brought down to the deeper floors, with them in their joints and their blood. New floors would generate more visitors, more points. more capacity to sustain the first floor's output against the pump's extraction rate. It was not a solution. It was a counterweight. It would buy time. I started building. The wall I learned about from the intelligence report. The timing was designed for irony, or felt that way. 3 days after I had calculated the depletion rate and started building counterweights, the intelligence summary arrived. The second unit had returned to the NASA mansion from intensive dungeon training and found a section of the external wall destroyed. Vida's summary of the scene was characteristically precise. The wall had been breached from the interior. The mechanism was a steam-powered prototype that Ava had modified from an earlier failed design. The prototype had moved. Then, the safety braking system had failed. The wall was in the path of the momentum. Ava's own account, according to the intelligence, was that the test had been a success. She was not wrong by her own definitions. The mechanism had worked. The steam had generated the force she had predicted. The failure was in the safety system, which was a secondary problem. Important, but secondary to the question of whether the core mechanism was valid. The core mechanism was valid. She had also apparently taken the empty tin cans from the food dungeon's luncheon meat, the ones Vida's unit had been converting to cold pack containers for the hot spring floors, and built a small demonstration model, a tiny steam-powered boat. She lit a candle under it, and it moved across a basin of water. The scientists at the Royal Research Institute, according to the intelligence, had reacted to this demonstration with approximately the same emotional register as someone who had just watched the beginning of something they could not stop. They were not wrong either. Ava was moving into the Royal Research Institute, budget secured, proof of principle established. She was going to build the full version. The full version would pump first floor spring water at dozens of times the efficiency of the current apparatus. I looked at the monitoring feed. At the first floor, spring pressure slowly falling. At the new floors, 19 and 20, still building. The mana flow not yet fully established. At the letter in the record file, which I had kept, which I still had not deleted. She was brilliant. She was doing exactly what I had unknowingly trained her to do, going deeper, building bigger, driven by a curiosity the dungeon had fed from the first day she touched the water. Every step in that chain traced back to my design. The will was listening. The will also had a spring depletion problem and no way to explain it to the person who caused it, who would be horrified if she knew, and who was currently watching a tin can boat cross a basin of water and calling it the beginning of everything. It probably was. Peta appeared beside me a while later, carrying a plate. She set it down without comment. Whatever was on it, the smell was excellent. I said, "She is going to scale it up." "I know." Peta sat down. "Eat something." This was her answer to most things. She was not wrong about that either. I ate. The spring continued to decline. The new floors continued to build. Somewhere above us, inside the research institute, Ava was drawing plans on paper with the focused energy of someone who had been told yes by the universe and was not going to stop asking questions until she had heard everything the universe knew. The dungeon had built the trap. The dungeon had walked her into it, one floor at a time, and now the dungeon's first spring was slowly draining because it had done its job too well. I thought, this is what the planted seed looks like when it pays off. Not a triumph, not a crisis exactly. Something more complicated than either, a consequence. The design had worked. The woman was brilliant. The spring was dying. All three things were true at the same time, and none of them resolved the others. I finished the food. I told Peta the 19th floor was ready. She said, "I know. I built it with you." I said, "I know." We sat there together for a while, watching the dungeon do what it did. The floor 1 spring was still declining, not fast, not dramatically. Every time I checked the output gauge on the monitoring feed, it was down another fraction from where it had been before, a slow bleed. I had added floors 19 and 20 as a counterweight, more miasma cycling through the system, more point generation, more pressure in the deep channels. But the pump on the surface was extracting faster than I could compensate with additional architecture alone. The math was not comfortable. It had not been comfortable for weeks. I watched it, and I did what I could. That was the job now. The stamina recovery spring on floor 18 had been a project in itself. I had spent most of 2 weeks seeding it, running new miasma channels down the eastern wall of the 18th floor, finding the pressure differential that would let me establish a stable node that far down. The stamina recovery water needed denser miasma than the basic skin springs. Floor 18 had it, barely. I had to seed and reseed 3 times before the node held. On the 4th attempt, it caught, and by morning, it was running. warm and faintly luminous, the gold tinge that meant full regenerative function. Peta checked it twice before she believed it. The monitoring feed showed Vita and her unit arriving on the same day the spring stabilized. Vita had that quality of moving through the dungeon like she had always lived here. Not comfortable, exactly. She was always alert, always reading the environment, but at ease with the fact of it. She was stronger now than when she had first arrived in the dungeon 2 years ago. The difference was visible in how she carried herself. She had started taking stairs 4 at a time on the upper floors without seeming to notice she was doing it. She reached floor 18, and Tori was there waiting with a pot of curry that smelled like something you would pay for in a real restaurant. I could not hear the conversation, but I had built in enough monitoring to read the shape of it. They sat. Tori had the same way of hosting that he had developed over years of living in the dungeon. Nothing formal, nothing arranged, just an assumption that food would fix whatever the current problem was. He had been running the 18th floor's training operations for long enough that it had stopped being a posting and started being a home. Vita's reports had mentioned the rainbow ore handles. I had been following that thread in the intelligence summaries. The armament dungeon's alloy knowledge, which Forge had traded to me in exchange for information about carbon ratios and hardening temperatures, had made it into the surface metalworking community through channels I had not directly opened. Vita and her unit had been spending their rest periods in the hot springs equipment soaking pools, running metal through a specific heat treatment cycle that softened the rainbow ore enough to allow crude shaping, not the fine work that the surface's best smiths could produce, but enough for handle insets, mace heads, hammer grips where the ore provided impact mass and the alloy handle absorbed vibration instead of transmitting it up the arm. The dungeon had given them the metallurgy. They had figured out how to apply it. Through the monitoring, I watched Tori gesture at something, probably describing the curry blend. He had very specific opinions about that, and Vita nod. On the 18th floor, the new stamina recovery spring was running at full output behind them, warm and steady, gold lit in the miasma glow. The floor had everything now: training water, recovery water, deep floor weapons in development, food that would make an experienced cook cry with professional jealousy. Knights who had started in this dungeon as ordinary soldiers were leaving it as something else entirely, not just stronger, but different in how they thought about their own bodies and what they were capable of. What I had built was not a hot spring dungeon. It was a machine for making people extraordinary, and the hot spring was just the delivery mechanism. The curry scene went on for a while. There was something else mixed into the conversation. I watched Tori's posture change at one point, a shift from relaxed hosting to focused interest. The way he moved when a technical question arrived that he actually wanted the answer to. One of Vita's unit was showing him something, a small flask maybe, something that caught the light from the dungeon wall. Ava had been developing a distilled alcohol in parallel with the steamwork. The intelligence summaries had mentioned it, a liquid so concentrated that it was flammable, that could not be drunk without dilution to a fraction of its base strength, that had been described by the researchers who tried it as tasting like a very sincere mistake. I had not connected it to the stamina recovery project, but the fermentation knowledge I had given the food dungeon network had eventually reached the surface, as it always did, filtered through the food dungeon and into the hands of people who knew what to do with improved yeasts and temperature control. Ava had done something with it that nobody else had thought to do. She had burned it. Tori was very interested in this. I watched him turn the flask over, hold it up, ask several questions that made Vita elaborate carefully. At one point, he gestured toward the upper floors, toward the surface, toward the NASA estate, in a way that meant, I need to see this in person. Another thread converging. Everything in this phase was converging. The curry scene ended. Vita stood, thanked someone, Tori, maybe, or one of the unit members, and began the long climb back to the surface. I tracked her through the monitoring points for a while. She had the easy stride of someone who had made this climb 100 times. I turned back to the floor 1 feed. The spring pressure was down another half measure. 4 more miasma channels went into the 19th floor. It was not going to be enough. The full pump was coming, and when it arrived, the counterweight architecture would be tested against something I could not yet measure. There was nothing else to do but keep building. The intelligence report about Ava came through 3 days after Vita's return. It was not a report exactly. It was a monitoring capture from the surface observation points on the dungeon's exterior wall, a narrow line of sight through the tree cover that gave me, on a clear day, a partial view of the rear of the NASA estate grounds. What I saw was engineers, a great number of them, in the courtyard where Ava had previously demolished a wall, working around something large. I adjusted my angle and held it. The thing in the courtyard was massive. Even at this distance, even through the imperfect monitoring, I could see the scale of it, iron and brass, bolted and sealed, with connection points along its body where pipes had been fitted and tested and refitted until the layout was right. A boiler unit, a piston assembly, a drive mechanism. The components were connected now, the whole thing unified into a single object, and it was sitting in the NASA courtyard on a section of track that ran maybe 40 meters toward the far garden wall, a steam engine for a train. I sat with that for a long time. She had started from the lighthouse. The lighthouse reflectors had led to lens grinding, which had led to precision instruments, which had given her the measurement tools to work with fine tolerances, which had made the valve fittings possible, which had allowed the pressure ratios to actually function, which had produced the engine. Each step had followed from the last. She had not planned a train. She had planned the next step, and the next, and the next, and the sequence had produced a train, because that was what the sequence produced when you followed it honestly. I had given the world the knowledge that started that sequence. I had not built the engine. I could not have. I knew the theory. I had watched enough history of technology documentaries dying in that hospital room that I could sketch the principles. But the details, the specific tolerances for this world's materials and this world's metalworking capability, the substitution of roller bearings for ball bearings because perfect spheres were beyond current manufacturing, but cylinders were not. The exact roux ratios and cool-down times that had nothing to do with engines, but had everything to do with Ava having enough food in her body to keep working. I knew none of that. She had worked those out herself. She had taken the foundation I built and constructed something on it that I never could have. My knowledge had an expiration date. The day I died, the update stopped. But the people who learned from the world I built, they could keep going. They were not limited to what I remembered. They were limited only by what they could figure out. She had figured out a train, not by copying what I knew. My knowledge of engines was theoretical, the kind of understanding you develop watching documentary programs in a hospital bed with nothing else to do. I knew that pressure in a closed vessel could be converted to rotational force. I knew the principle, but the principle and the machine are separated by 10,000 hours of people like Ava working in a workshop, building a thing that breaks and asking why it broke, and building a better version. My knowledge stopped the day I died. Everything after that was hers. That was the only way it could have worked. If she had been copying me, she would have been limited to what I remembered. She was not copying me. She had used the foundation and built in her own direction, and the direction she built in was ahead of anything I could have reached alone. The limitation that I thought was my weakness, the knowledge cutoff, the hard stop at the moment of my death, turned out to be the thing that made her achievement genuinely hers. I watched through the monitoring as Vita arrived at the estate gate. The guard let her through. She crossed the courtyard toward the main building and stopped when she saw the machine. Even from this angle, I could see her stop. She stood for a moment, looking at it. Then she walked toward the group of engineers around its base. One of them gestured, explaining something, running through something technical. Vita listened. She had the expression she always had when receiving a briefing she was not sure she wanted the contents of. Then Ava came out of the building. She was talking before she reached the group. That was characteristic. She thought faster than she moved, and by the time she arrived at a conversation, she had already been in it for several seconds. She was explaining something, gesturing at the boiler section, and then at the track, and then at something beyond the garden wall. I could not hear her. I could read enough of the shape of it from 40 meters through tree cover and imperfect monitoring to know she was describing cargo capacity, test parameters, the specific experiments she planned to run on the pressure tolerances. Vita was asking her something that made Ava pause. Then she answered. From her posture, I could tell the answer was not safe. We are testing how far it goes before it breaks. The only way to find the limit is to reach it. That was how she had always worked. The failure mode of an experiment was not the threat. It was the information. I watched Vita absorb this with the specific stillness of someone deciding whether to argue or accept. And then Ava went down, not slowly. She was mid-sentence, one hand still raised in explanation, and then she was not. She dropped the way that a person drops when the body has simply stopped negotiating, without warning, without staging, without the kind of gradual swaying that gives you a moment to react. Vita caught her. I am not sure how. Vita was a step to her left and slightly behind, and the catch should not have been possible in the time available. But her reflexes, after years in this dungeon, were not normal anymore, and she moved before the fall registered consciously, and Ava did not hit the ground. The engineers went very still. Vita was already assessing. I knew her well enough to read that even at this distance. Checking breathing, checking pulse. Ava had not lost consciousness dramatically. She had simply run out. The engineers hovered. Vita said something to them, 2 words, maybe 3, and they stepped back. She gathered Ava carefully, the way you carry someone when you know you have to carry them a long way. I could not follow them inside the building. The monitoring points on the dungeon's outer surface did not have angles through the estate walls. I held the partial view of the courtyard for a while. The engineers stayed near the machine. They talked among themselves, quietly. One of them went to check a fitting on the boiler, and then came back and said something, and the others nodded. The engine sat in the morning light. It was ready. It had been assembled and tested in pieces, and the pieces had been fitted together and tested again, and the engineers had measured and adjusted and remeasured, and everything was within tolerance. One test run, and they would know if it worked. Ava was inside. I turned back to the floor, one monitoring feed. The spring output had declined another fraction while I was watching the surface. Floors 19 and 20 were cycling, the miasma channels running at maximum, the counterweight architecture holding the decline at a rate I could still manage. The dungeon was 200 meters below where Ava was sleeping, running its quiet processes, completely indifferent to the engine sitting in the courtyard above it. PETA came and put a plate next to me without saying anything. The floor 1 output line held. The 19th and 20th floors were building. The dungeon had 20 functional floors now, which was more than it had ever had, and the floor 1 spring that had started all of it, the simple first idea, heat and water and miasma made into something that healed instead of harmed, was drying slowly because someone had been smart enough to build a pump that could extract it faster than the earth could replace it. I had built the thing that built the pump. That was the chain. I was responsible for it, in the way that teaching someone to fish makes you responsible for whatever they catch. The 4th floor monitoring point picked up a maid crossing the courtyard. She stopped at the engineers group and said something. One of them answered. She turned and went back inside. A few minutes later, the maid came back out. She stood by the door. The engineers looked at her. She shook her head. The engineers sat down. One of them produced something from a bag. I thought it was food. They settled in the courtyard with the machine and the morning light and the track that ran 40 meters toward the garden wall. I watched Vita later through the same monitoring angle. She was sitting against the wall outside a door. I could not see which room. She had her knees up and her arms folded on them and her head down. Her posture said, "I am not moving from here." A maid appeared again at the far end of the corridor. The monitoring angle was very imperfect now. I was piecing together what I could from multiple surface points and said something to Vita. The engineers are ready. Probably that. Or they want to know when. Vita looked up. She said something, short, 2 or 3 words. The maid went back to the courtyard. Vita did not move from her position against the wall. Sometime after that, I could not track the time precisely from this angle. The dungeon's internal clock did not translate exactly to surface time. She stopped being upright. She had fallen asleep where she was, back against the wall, next to Ava's door. The engine waited. It was sitting in the NASA courtyard, with the morning burning off the metal, ready to test. One run from proving whether the whole theory was right. All those steps, all those letters and reports and intelligence summaries and knowledge trades and floors built to produce the visitors who needed the floors, who funded the dungeon that produced the knowledge that reached the surface and made its way to a young woman with a disease that was trying to kill her, who got into the 1st floor spring and came out changed and spent the years after that trying to understand what had changed her. She had wanted to talk to the dungeon's will. She had sent that note through the intelligence system, written carefully, wanting to say thank you to whatever was responsible. She had never gotten an answer. I could not answer. The dungeon had no voice, no channel, no mechanism for reaching through 200 meters of stone and water and miasma to say, "I see you." But there was an engine in her courtyard. That was what I had. Ava slept. Vita slept outside her door. The engineers sat in the courtyard with the machine between them and the morning light. The floor 1 spring continued its slow decline. The deep floors ran their quiet cycles. The dungeon kept being what it was, heat and water and miasma and knowledge accumulated over years of watching and building and waiting. All of it pointed at a world it could not enter and a woman it could not speak to. 200 meters below, one test run away. That was the gap. That was what it had always been. The engine waited.